In the recent years, Ultra Ball has become a staple item card in the Pokemon trading card game. And it's an interesting card in the sense that if you were to show it to someone that's new to TCGs or even just a Pokemon, they would probably say it's a pretty bad card. But that couldn't be further from the truth. Having to discard 2 cards might seem like a steep cost just to find a Pokemon out of our deck, but it's a fair price to pay for the versatility and consistency that Ultra Ball brings to any deck. Discarding cards from hand is a pretty common cost in Pokemon. We're most often trading resources from our hand to find specific resources from our deck, and figuring out which cards to discard isn't always completely obvious, but today I'm going to go over some things that should help make it easier. There are a few main categories that I put cards into when I'm figuring out what I should be discarding. The first category is going to be the easy discards. A few examples of this are cards that we want in the discard pile, like Psychic Energy in a Gardevoir deck or United Wings Pokemon in a United Wings deck. We're also going to put tech cards for other matchups into this category, like if we're playing TM Devo in our deck and we're up against a big basic deck, this is a pretty easy discard. And we would also put cards with diminishing returns into this category, like Buddy Buddy Poffin in the mid to late game. And the other main category is going to be cards that we can't or don't want to discard. This is going to be things like text for the matchup that we're playing, or our last gust effect like Boss's Order or Counter Catcher, or even our last recovery card like Super Rod or Night Stretcher. Always having access to something like Boss or Night Stretcher is going to kind of safeguard us from any weird stuff happening. The last thing that we're not going to want to discard is cards that we need immediately. Taking a moment to kind of play out the rest of the turn in our head and figuring out what cards we're actually going to use will often narrow down our Ultra Ball choices by quite a bit. And even though I keep saying Ultra Ball, of course this does apply to any cards that are going to discard cards from our hand. Some other kind of general rules for this are be careful getting rid of too many draw supporters. We don't want to get ourselves in a position where we have really low odds of drawing a draw supporter card off of a late game Iono, or even getting rid of too many of our own Ionos and then not being able to disrupt our opponent later in the game. This maybe doesn't apply as much now, but in a deck like Gardevoir, we want to be careful getting rid of too many Poffins, because in most decks, it's pretty natural to just start discarding them after the first turn or two, but in decks like Gardevoir specifically, we can get Drifloon, which is one of our main attackers with it, so it's always nice to have extra outs to our attackers. And I also try to stay away from discarding another Ultra Ball with an Ultra Ball, which this is like super situational, but it can be really natural to just automatically snap discard the Ultra Ball with our Ultra Ball, but it really is a nice card to have around, and not just for finding Pokemon, but for thinning cards out of the deck, so I usually try to stay away from that. Or if it's later in the game, I try to think if there's any way that I can Ultra Ball my hand down and get a Pokemon that I don't need anymore, and then discard that with my second Ultra Ball, and then grab the Pokemon that I wanted with the second one. And if we have a hand that we feel has no discardable cards and we're going to play something like an Iono, it is always worth considering if we actually need to play the Ultra Ball right away. Usually for this, I try to think of what are the consequences of me missing the Pokemon on the other side of the Iono. Like, do I just lose the game if I don't get this Pokemon right away? Or do I have a turn or two to finish setting up? Like, say for example, we're playing the winning Gardevoir list from the Monterey Regional. We have a hand that looks like this, and we are up against Dragapult Dusknoir. Now, there could definitely be some type of argument to just Iono and see if we get into the Gardevoir on the other side, and if we don't, just Artisan for a Badoo, and hopefully we can retreat into it and item lock again, because this is a pretty solid matchup for Guardy, so we're not in a huge rush, but this hand is pretty broken, so I don't know if we just want to do that. And when we really think about the hand, it is pretty straightforward to play out. Like, we want to play down the Monkey Dory with the Dark Energy, so we can't Ultra Ball those away. We want to use Iono to draw cards, and we would like to use the rare candy to candy into our Gardevoir so that we don't have a 70 HP Ralt sitting on the bench, and we always have our Curlia that we can evolve to a Gardevoir later in the game. So when we think about it that way, the only real choice is to Ultra Ball away the Lily's Clefairy and Counter Catcher, grab the Gardevoir EX, candy into Guardy, bench the Monkey Dory, attach the Dark, and play Iono as our last card in hand. Now, getting rid of the Counter Catcher in this situation is a little bit rough, but both Dragapult and Gardevoir are decks that are trying to play from behind so they can play their own Counter Catchers, so there's a decent chance that we won't get use out of that anyway. And the Clefairy, while it is good in the matchup, we do play for Night Stretcher in this list, so it is a pretty easy discard. And whenever I have hands like this in real life, I'll usually just go through my hand and set the cards face down that I plan to play out that turn. And then after I have all the cards that I plan to play face down on the table, I look at my hand and those are the choices that I have to Ultra Ball with. Well, with hands like that, it can be pretty straightforward as to what to discard, and it may seem like it should be easier to pick discard targets with a bigger hand, but sometimes bigger hands can make it even less obvious what we should get rid of. And there is a couple of reasons for this, but the first one we'll talk about is a bigger hand is usually going to have more cards that we want to save for later in the game. And to figure out the cards that we're going to need later in the game, that really comes down to prize mapping, which seems to be a common theme with all these videos that I do, but I guess prize mapping is really important. But if we figure out which one of our opponent's Pokemon we're going to knock out and which of our Pokemon we're going to use to do it, it's going to make it easier for us to know which resources we need for later. But usually what I'll do with these hands is break them down into the categories that I was talking about earlier, where we can put all the cards that we absolutely can't get rid of to one side of our hand and the cards that are easy to discard to the other side. Now, if we have two easy to discard cards, that's usually simple enough. We can just get rid of those, but it's often not that simple. There's of course a lot of factors and every situation is different, but I try to think of it as I give the remaining cards sort of a ranking as to how important they are or how likely I think that I am to need them later. And then just kind of ranking them in my mind from least important to most important will make it a lot easier to figure out what we can get rid of. Obviously, we're going to get rid of the cards that are less important. But say for example, we are playing Terrabox and we have a hand that looks like this. We're playing against some evolving deck and we want to use Wellspring Ogerpon this turn and we have to Ultra Ball for a Noctowl. And we've also already looked through the deck, so we know that we prized one energy switch. I'd say that there is two cards in this hand that we absolutely cannot get rid of, and that is Sparkling Crystal and Energy Switch. Those are two cards we're almost definitely going to need for later, so our choices are between the rest of the cards. Now, out of these options, two really stand out to me, and that is Lightning Energy and Boss's Orders. I think those are pretty important. There's only one Lightning Energy in this deck, and if we discard it, we're going to be committed to spending a Night Stretcher on it later, so I think that has pretty high value. And there's only two boss in the deck. We're going ahead in prizes, so Counter Catcher is probably not going to be live. So I think Boss's Orders is another card that is also going to be high value. Now we've narrowed it down to discarding Counter Catcher, Nest Ball, or Mew EX. I think Counter Catcher can go. We're going to go ahead in the game and hopefully we're going to stay ahead, so I think I would get rid of that one. And I do think it is a toss-up between Nest Ball and Mew. Nest Ball is pretty valuable in decks like this where we want to find a new attacker most turns, but Mew EX is also valuable because it's going to let us draw off of late game Ionos, and I think deciding between those two is really going to come down to the matchup. Like, if we think our opponent is going to be able to knock out our Wellspring next turn, maybe we discard the Mew and Nest Ball for Pheasantipity. But if we think that there is a low chance that they knock anything out for the next couple of turns, we probably just discard the Nest Ball and bench Mew and try to get some value from it now. Now, the other thing that can make discarding cards out of a bigger hand not so obvious is the idea of thinning, and that is just discarding cards that we don't want in our deck for later in the game. Now, this doesn't really make it harder to decide what to discard, but I do think it makes it more likely to be messed up. Like if we have a really big hand with a few Poffins in it, but we also have a couple other cards that we're not going to need for later, it can be pretty natural to just Ultra Ball away 2 Poffins and grab what we want. But more often, the correct way to go about it is to just play the Poffins out of hand and then use the Ultra Ball to discard 2 other cards that we don't need instead. Now, say for example, we are playing Dragapult and we have a hand that looks like this. We want to Ultra Ball for a Dragapult and Iono our opponent. Now, the simple answer might be just Ultra Ball away the 2 Poffin, grab the Dragapult, and play Iono, and while that's going to be fine, it's really not the best way to go about it. Often at the end of the game, my goal with Ultra Balls in a hand like this is to get rid of as many cards as I possibly can without getting rid of cards that I'm going to need to win the game. So say if we're at 3 prizes now and we're going down to 1 prize this turn, we know that we're not going to need Counter Catcher, so we can automatically get rid of that. And in this situation, that also means that Arven is not going to be useful, so that is an easy card to get rid of. So the only cards that we really want to keep is the Iono and the Boss, and Turo is a nice card to keep around as well. We can attach the rescue board to our Cloak with no energy so that it can't be stuck in the active spot. And now we just want to burn as many cards out of our hand as possible. So we can Ultra Ball away Arven and Counter Catcher and grab a Pokemon that is not Dragapult, and then Ultra Ball away that Pokemon as well as Psychic Energy to grab our Dragapult EX. And then now we can just play both of our buddy Poffins and Nest Ball out of our hand, and then we've successfully played our hand down to just Turo, Boss, and Iono, and thinned like 9 dead cards out of our deck. And having a turn like that where we can thin a ton of cards out of the deck really shouldn't be underrated. Pokemon is a game of probabilities. Having cards like Ultra Ball or Vessel where we can thin dead cards out of our hand can be the difference to whether or not we draw the card we need to win. Now there is one other scenario that I want to cover. It's an unfortunate scenario that everyone runs into from time to time, and it's when all that we have in our hand is an Ultra Ball and cards that we absolutely can't discard, but if we don't, we're going to lose the game. In these situations, it is unfortunate, but we just have to play the Ultra Ball, get whatever Pokemon we need, and try our best to form a new plan. And if the cards are really that important and we're playing best of 3, we can just scoop the game, but I find it's usually worth playing out at least the next couple of turns and trying to come up with a new plan, or at least seeing what our opponent is going to do, because sometimes getting rid of those cards doesn't even end up mattering if our opponent isn't drawing well. These situations usually look like this, and our opponent is threatening a knockout next turn, so we know we need to Ultra Ball for at least our attacker and do something. But in these situations when we're down bad already and we have to Ultra Ball away all of our gusting effects, it's usually worth Ultra Balling for Pheasantipede or Mew or something to draw cards to try and high roll something like Iono and our attacker, instead of just Ultra Balling for our attacker and hoping that our opponent can't knock it out the next turn. Something I like to do to sort of practice this is when I'm watching good players play, like one of Azul's videos, or Rowan Stavinaw has a channel and posts videos sometimes. Whenever they go to Ultra Ball, Vessel, or Superior or whatever, I just take a moment to think what I think the best cards to get rid of are, and if they pick a different card, I just try to figure out the reason for it, and it just ends up being like a new piece of information that I learned. But I find that this is a pretty solid way to practice while also getting immediate answers. Obviously they're not going to play perfectly all the time, and some amount of the time they're going to discard the wrong stuff, but players like that are really good are most often going to be able to Ultra Ball away the right cards. So in conclusion, whenever we're figuring out what to discard, we want to separate the cards from easy discards and cards that we can't get rid of, and figuring out what cards we need immediately will often make Ultra Balls just kind of play themselves out. But if that's not the case, we can kind of rank the cards in our hand and discard a couple of the cards that are on the lower end of the ranking. And if you think I missed anything, or there's another topic that you want to hear me talk about, leave it in a comment below. That's where I got the idea for this video, so I always appreciate that. I want to give a huge shout out to the channel members, thank you so much. And a special thanks to the newest channel member, Confetta, hopefully I pronounced that right, but I really appreciate it. And since I talked about prize mapping in this video, I'm going to put the prize mapping video right up here. If you like this one, I think you'll like that one for sure. And like or dislike, comment, and subscribe. Take care and have a good one.